Good morning. My name is Pastor Steve Peters, and I am the pastor of Chapin Christian Church in Chapin, Illinois. Thank you for joining us this morning. This morning, I am going to take a look at Mark 9, verses 30 through 37. And I thought it was important that we talk about this chapter a little bit because this week I've been thinking a lot about something, and that's sometimes we are hesitant to take something that's concerning us or upsetting us or worrying us, or sometimes even something that we're joyous about, to Jesus or to God to talk to about or in prayer. We just hesitate. Sometimes we don't feel it's worthy. Sometimes we just don't know what to do. So let's read our scripture this morning and let's spend a little time talking about Jesus. This is Mark 9, 30 through 37. And in the verses just before this, Jesus had healed a boy that his father brought to him. The father explained that an evil spirit was inside of the boy, and sometimes the boy couldn't speak, and it would even throw him to the ground in convulsions. Jesus ordered the spirit to come out of the boy, and the spirit came out, and Jesus helped the boy to get up, and he did. So that's where we begin right now. So Jesus and his disciples left that place, and they went on through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where he was because he was teaching his disciples. He started, "The Son of Man will be handed over to those who will kill him. 3 days later, however, he will rise back to life." But they did not understand what he was talking about or what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him. They came to Capernaum, and after going indoors, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they would not answer him, because on the road they had been arguing among themselves about who was the greatest. Jesus sat down, called the 12 over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must place himself last of all and be the servant of all." Then he took a child and had the child stand in front of him. He put his arms around him and said to them, "Whoever welcomes in my name one of these children welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also the one who sent me." May God bless this reading from the scriptures. Maybe some of you have heard of, I guess you call it a video, an Instagram, a podcast. Famous, well-known people, and some they've, they've been famous for something. It varies. It varies greatly depending on who it is. But they have been put in front of the camera or in front of the microphone, and they've said, "Ask me anything." In fact, that's the name of the first show that came out, "Ask Me Anything." I think it might have started on Reddit, which is something on the internet, but a lot of different platforms are doing it now. Here were some of the titles, the most famous titles. "I saved a girl from drowning, then she sued me." "I am a 74-time Jeopardy champion Ken Jennings. I will not be answering in the form of a question. I'm a has-been rock star who sold 5 million plus records and lost twice at the Grammys. Ask me anything. I am a jury member who caused a hung jury. 2 months later, the evidence showed that the person was indeed guilty. Ask me anything. It was a very popular show. It included all of Barack Obama, Gordon Ramsay, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Arnold Schwarzenegger. They all got involved. So I thought it might be fun today to ask all of you who you might like to ask a question where you weren't restricted in any way. And it could be, well, let's think about any person nationally or internationally. That would be fun, wouldn't it? I have a lot of questions for, Abe Lincoln and William Shakespeare, but who would you like to ask questions of? Who that you have heard about or thought about in your living and your history would be fun to question. So let's keep that in mind. And let's imagine what it would be like for Jesus to come back. I mean, for this show, and to have an Ask Me Anything session with, with Jesus. Wouldn't that be fun? Ask Jesus anything. And if that were to happen, what would be one of the first questions you would ask him? Anybody? I suppose one of the first questions would be, is God really God? Or maybe, are you really his son? And then, well, I'm sure questions would start pouring out all over the place. Were you really crucified? Were you really buried in that tomb? Did you come back to life and return to your disciples and your friends? Jesus, could you have saved yourself? Why didn't you? Maybe someone would ask him if he plans to return for good, to bring heaven to earth, and to end all of the fighting and the pain, the suffering, and all this death in the world. I'm sure there'd be a long list that Jesus would be asked. Perhaps one of these questions would be the one the disciples in our story were really too afraid to ask in today's gospel. That question, I believe, was, why did you have to suffer and die before being raised again? Jesus, were you scared? In his gospel, Jesus is teaching his disciples that he was going to be betrayed, and then he would be killed, and 3 days later he would rise again. Now that was really hard for his disciples. But the reading tells us that he didn't think they understood what he was saying. But they were afraid to ask, or maybe they had questions or concerns, but for whatever reason, they just seemed confused. But the disciples didn't ask Jesus to explain and give more detail. I assume because they were afraid. They didn't want to act like stupid. Maybe they were afraid of the answer. Maybe they really didn't know why this had to happen. Maybe they were afraid of what it might mean for them. These disciples, followers, had been with Jesus for years, some from close to the beginning. Surely at this point in time, they should know some of this. They should know that Jesus was going to have to be betrayed and killed and then come back, shouldn't they? Maybe they were ashamed to admit that they really didn't know, or maybe they'd put it behind them and they didn't want to think about it. Maybe they didn't think that if they asked Jesus, he would be happy with them. If he really believed that he must do this, then asking him why might make him think of you differently. But for whatever reason, the disciples don't ask Jesus to explain. And because of that, I'll call it because they're afraid, they begin to ask or think about the wrong things and ask the wrong questions. And isn't that something that we do? When we ignore one question and still are concerned, we go to something else. We get all tangled up thinking about the wrong question. We see this often. And we can see it in our own lives too. For whatever reason, whatever happens that makes us get off track, we avoid asking the right question. For the disciples, the wrong question became, who is the greatest among them? As they were walking, they got entangled into this idea. Who is the greatest of the disciples? Maybe they were thinking about, well, if Jesus leaves, one of us has to keep this thing going. One of us has to become the leader. Maybe even, who would take over? Now, I don't know how this relationship thing with God would be, but they were tangled up in thinking about something different than what they really wanted to talk about, going in the wrong direction in their minds, trying to avoid the confrontation that they might have if they asked what they really wanted to ask. When Jesus and his disciples came back to Capernaum, Jesus decided that it was time to help them see the truth and how foolish their debate had been about who's the greatest. So he turned to them and he said, "What were you arguing about along the way?" They were silent, but Jesus knew all along. And so he answers that question. He says, "Whoever wants to be great must serve, and whoever wants to be first must be willing to be last." And then he placed a small child among them, a child who doesn't know much because he's so young and has been following Jesus, has not been following Jesus along the way. And he says that whoever wants to become great should start by welcoming this child in his name. And Jesus is trying to teach us that to be great in his kingdom is to serve people and children and put their needs first. Servants and slaves are the last to have their needs met. But here's the question that the story leaves me with. What if the disciples got up the courage to ask the question that was really on their minds. The question of why their hope for Messiah must be killed and then be raised on the third day. What if they asked that question? Wouldn't asking that question help them understand what Jesus was up to and bring them even closer to him and help them understand? And that they too are being invited to follow Jesus, to lose their lives too for the sake of the gospel, and in doing so, find new life? Wouldn't getting into that conversation have made the argument that they're having among themselves and make them see that they were silly for feeling bad or guilty about it or scared? It's hard to argue about who's the greatest when you're trying to understand why God's Son has to die on a cross. Sometimes asking the right question is just as important or more so than finding the right answer. One of my debate textbooks that was written by a friend builds a case for asking the right question and suggests that asking the right questions at the right time could change the world. Jesus wants us to ask him anything. Let's think of it another way. Do you remember the two questions that Jesus asked God before he was taken and tried and crucified, and as he was dying on the cross? They're the most important questions that Jesus ever asked God. While praying in the garden, Jesus prayed to his Father to take this cup from him, meaning, do I have to do this? Do I have to die? And from the cross, in what must have been the darkest moment of his life, he asked, my God, why have you forsaken me? Surely Jesus wasn't supposed to ask these things. He knew that this had to happen. He knew he had to be killed. He predicted it ahead of time. He predicted it in today's gospel. In fact, but he also knew that he would be raised on the third day. But here he is on the cross, asking his Father this painfully honest and troubling question. Why have you abandoned me? And when Jesus asks his questions, he wants to make sure that he's supposed to be doing this. In a way, it's similar to the question the disciples are afraid to ask Jesus, isn't it? Maybe the main difference between Jesus and the disciples is simply he asked the question. He was willing to ask the crucial question. Why, God, have you forgotten me? And it's important to remember that the answer may not come immediately or in the way that we think it will. Jesus knew the answer to both questions. In the case of the garden and the cross, he just needed reassurance. And sometimes the answer comes right away, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it takes a while. And sometimes we already know the answer. We just need to ask and then work it through in our own minds. It seems to me that if Jesus can ask those kinds of questions, Jesus, God's Son, can ask his Father those questions, that nothing is out of bounds for even us. But there is something critical to remember in Jesus' question. And when Jesus asks these questions, he begins it with the words, my Father or my God. Jesus is asking the question, yes, but he's not giving up on that relationship that he has with his Father. Isn't that what people of faith do? We ask God the tough questions, the questions that we are uncertain about or that trouble us. But we ask them because of our faith. This morning, I want to challenge you to ask yourself, are there any questions that I want to ask God or Jesus? Is there anything that I'm not sure about or something that I want to be certain about that I need to ask God? I have a lot of prayers out there, a lot of things that I am praying for right now. And some of them are very big and personal concerns and things that I need help with, things I want to know the answer to. But I wonder, I still wonder, is it okay to ask God? Am I wrong to ask Him what's happening with these? I've been praying about them for a long time, and I don't know. I'm not doubting or questioning Him, and I believe if Jesus can give me any hope or hints about what will happen, I know He will. And we do this believing that one day our questions will be answered. And I look forward to that day. But in the meantime, we are called to live by our faith and to live with the questions, but still ask them. We have all these questions, we have all these things that are unanswered. Still ask. And then let's wait patiently in faith for an answer. And sometimes that's the hardest part, isn't it? Bottom line, to me, is just to keep that line of communication open between us and Jesus or us and God, always. So let's spend some more time this week asking God our questions. Ask God anything. Through our honest questions, let us draw nearer to God, trusting that when we do, God will draw near to us. And I believe that one day all of our questions will be answered. Amen.